to push. This measure, which would impose penalties on the
The Adirondacks, 6 million acres of wildlands located in northern New York State. With an endless variety of landscape, it is a land of ever-changing vistas, a land of rugged mountains, a land of vast forests where wildlife abounds. But above all else, it is a land of water. The Adirondack Park, established in 1892, encompasses some 9,400 square miles of territory, the largest park in the lower 48 states. More than 30 major rivers have their birthplace here, receiving the runoff from a network of 30,000 miles of brooks and streams. 2,800 lakes and ponds, carved by the glaciers, lie spread out over the headwaters. The combined geography of rivers, lakes, and streams forms an immense network of interconnected waterways, unique in North America and ideally suited for long-distance travel. Native Americans knew and used these waterways for thousands of years before the coming of the European. The Adirondacks were the ancient hunting grounds for the tribes of the Algonquin and the Iroquois. For these peoples, the rivers and lakes of the region were highways through the forest. Toward the mid-1800s, the Adirondacks and its waterways were discovered by Americans seeking recreation and escape from the travails of civilized life. Attracted by tales of fantastic journeys by guideboat and unlimited opportunities for fishing and hunting, thousands came from the eastern cities and beyond, leaving civilization behind for 2- and 3-week adventures in the wilderness. The author of the book by that name is largely credited with starting the rush to the Adirondacks. He was the Reverend William H. Murray, known then and now as Adirondack Murray. Murray himself was particularly impressed with the Adirondack waterways.
The novel and romantic peculiarity of this wilderness is its marvelous water communication. One can travel in a canoe or light boat for hundreds of miles in all directions through the forest.
For half a century, the Adirondacks were the center of small boat recreation in America. The American Canoe Association was formed in 1880 on the shores of Lake George. The waterways of the Adirondack wilderness were known and praised across the nation, and by none more so than the sportsman and journalist George Washington Sears, better known as Nessmuk. With his famous 9 1/2 pound canoe called the Sari Gamp, built by Adirondack native J. Henry Rushton, Nessmuk undertook a series of widely publicized solo canoe tours through the Adirondacks in the early 1880s. Nessmuk's solo Adirondack journeys and his go light philosophy set the trend for today's guideless canoeists who find their own adventure along the timeless waterways of the park. In the days of Murray, Rushton, and Nessmuk, all Adirondack waterways were open and available to any who desired, with or without a guide, to discover and explore this land of water. Today, the situation is dramatically different. Paul Jameson, author of a widely read guidebook to Adirondack canoe waters, explains.
The Adirondack Park is remarkable for its network of waterways. In the last century, all of these waters were open. The rivers, the creeks, and the chain lakes to public navigation. I often think that the people in the last century were luckier than we are today because they were obliged to travel by water. There were no roads then, or very few roads, and most people traveled simply by guideboat or canoe. They were luckier too in another way. They were lucky in being able to travel where they liked, all over the Adirondacks. Murray speaks of being able to travel by light boat for 100 miles or more in every direction. Today, this is no longer possible. Many of the rivers are closed either in part or in whole. By my estimate, at least 20 are involved in restrictions of one kind or another. Either the entire river is closed or parts of it, which prevent the canoeist from traveling as he would like from the head of navigability to the blue line.
The posting of river corridors and waterways has effectively closed hundreds of miles of canoe routes, long popular in the last century.
Several miles of the Beaver River are restricted through privately owned land. And here again, there is a blockage on a route that was popular during the last century. It was then possible to travel all the way from the western boundary of the park to the eastern boundary by way of the Beaver River, Harrison Creek, the Bond River flow, the Racket River, and the Saranac. Today, about 3 miles of the Beaver River are closed to public navigation, and this prevents such a trip.
Okay, there's a great shot of Lake Lila down there below us, and further off to the left you can see the Hassany Lake, and there's Stillwater Reservoir off in the background. Okay, let's fly down a little closer. Now you can see the Beaver River. Those are the rapids down there that are posted. That's preventing you from going all the way down to Stillwater Reservoir. All right, there's the mouth of the Beaver River at Stillwater Reservoir. Now you can see the lower section of rapids that are also posted. If it wasn't for these postings, it would open up a route from Stillwater Reservoir to Lake Lila, and from there across the Adirondack Park.
From the time of the arrival of the first tourists in the Adirondacks, about 1840, to approximately 1890, all the rivers were open, every one of them. About 1890, posting began in private lands, in private parks, and in lands owned by clubs such as the Adirondack League Club. The south branch of the Moose has been closed for 100 years in the 12-mile stretch that runs through that club property. For some reason, the state agencies did not step in to prevent this posting. The annual report of the Forest Commission in 1893 simply remarks that the Beaver River is now posted and that this puts an end to a once popular canoe route. It does not indicate that anything is being done to prevent that. And consequently, in the rest of the century, the last 10 years of the century, and on down through the 20th century, this posting of private land, of river corridors, has continued.
In a few cases, more than posting has been done. Here, between Forked and Little Forked Lakes, a fence has been erected across the channel, blocking navigation. Only from an airplane can one see what lies beyond the gate in this fence.
Furthermore, there are chain lakes that are off limits. One particular set of chain lakes is that in the Whitney Tract. In the last century, there was a long canoe trip of 110 miles making use of these chain ponds and lakes along with the Racket River. One started at Forked Lake and cruised into a little Forked Lake, and from there through a series of ponds to a little Tupper Lake, down the outlet of Little Tupper into Round Lake, from Round Lake into its outlets, and from that outlet into the Bob River, and thence into Big Tupper Lake, and then down the Racket. I have a friend who made this trip early in the century before it became impossible to do so. He was very enthusiastic about it. There are indeed 10 miles of carries on the route, but they are widely separated and also quite scenic. They are probably not in very good condition now because they haven't been used for the greater part of this century, but they could be used again if the Whitney Tract became another St. Regis canoe area.
In today's Adirondack Park, just a few years from the 21st century, small boat recreation is reaching ever higher levels of popularity, in part due to the availability of strong, lightweight materials. But the availability for use of hundreds of miles of last century's water routes has improved only slightly. There is hope on the horizon, however. Charles Morrison, Director of Land Resources at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, discusses the state's interest in clarifying the public's right of navigation.
I guess that I first got into it along about 1980 as an offshoot of our work on the State Wild, Scenic, and Recreational River System program. At that time, we started to develop a statewide canoe route system. And we had some communications with Paul Jameson up in Canton, whom I would give credit to as being really the father of this whole effort to clarify and reaffirm the right of the public to navigate on the rivers of the state. And Paul has been pushing this issue for many years. He had communications with Norm Van Valkenburg, our division director, on this issue. And then as we developed this canoe route system, it began to become obviously a major impediment. And what we really lacked at that time was a legal analysis of the common law and the case law going back over the past 100 years or so, which is a rather intensive legal job, because without that we really didn't have a basis for moving ahead and clarifying these rights and bringing them together in one focused way. So we tried to get some help at that time from our legal affairs office, but other priorities prevailed. And then along about 1983, I was transferred to the commissioner's office to work on other things, and so some impetus was lost there. And it wasn't until I met John Humbach, who was an associate dean of the Pace University Law School, that we really got back into it again. And that started along about 1988. I believe it was the fall of 1988, when John and I were working on the possible acquisition of Sterling Forest, which is a huge tract of land on the New York-New Jersey border. And we were talking about kayaking and canoeing and some other hobbies and pursuits of that type. And I found out that John had been researching this area and had a very great interest in it. And I told him about our previous involvements with the canoe routes effort and the issue of navigability that we ran into. And he offered to research the issue and to do the job of legal analysis that had long been missing. So, much to my amazement, instead of just assigning graduate students to the job, John undertook it himself. And within 3 months, he produced this 70 or 80 page report which looks at the common law and the case law over the last 100 years and really provides the basis for what we're doing right now.
When I began my study at the request of the Department of Environmental Conservation, I thought that I would be able to look at maybe 20 or so cases and discover exactly what the law is in New York on the public's right of passage. What I found was that the law as it developed from the very earliest cases at the beginning of the 1800s through to today was scattered amongst a large number of cases, and although the cases are mostly consistent, nevertheless each case only discusses a piece of the issue. Some cases will discuss at fairly great length what it is that makes a stream navigable versus non-navigable. Other cases will discuss the consequences of that. And because the law is scattered amongst a large number of cases, it is not so easy to find. It is not accessible even to lawyers unless they're willing to spend a good deal of time doing research, and it's certainly not accessible to members of the public, to the landowners, and to people who are interested in exercising the public right of navigation. And for that reason, perhaps, among others, a good deal of confusion has arisen. In any event, I have to conclude that there is a good deal of confusion where we have a situation today where many waterways which are eminently navigable and can very easily carry boats of fairly substantial size are being closed off, notwithstanding the fact that the consistent view of the courts from the earliest days of statehood on, and even before, has been that any stream which is capable of carrying boats or rafts or even logs is open as a public highway subject to the public easement which the state holds in trust for people to use the stream.
Most of the instances of restrictions are posted corridors at different points on the river, and legislation is needed to guarantee right of passage to the extent that the canoeist can do whatever is necessary for passage. That is, he can pole, he can line his canoe along the shore, he can wade the riverbed, he can, where necessary, carry his canoe on shore at the nearest point where it is safe to do so.
It is quite clear from the cases that a stream is considered navigable and therefore subject to the public's right of transportation if the stream is navigable in fact for most of its length, and the fact that there are occasional obstacles or waterfalls or rapids, shoals and the like that make the stream non-navigable at particular points does not detract from the fact that the stream is considered navigable overall and therefore open to the public.
In Maine, and also in all the New England states, it's worth noting, all the rivers are open to public navigation and have been since Aboriginal times. Common law has prevailed there to keep them open. But in a park which was dedicated in 1892 to the free use of all the people for their health and pleasure, in that particular park there are more closings than in any other part of New York State or in any other state of the northeastern United States.
Well, one of the things that I discovered in my research is that New York is one of the very few states in this country which holds that the ownership of land under its navigable waters is in the private hands of the upland owners. And most American states, under the general American common law rule, the navigable waters within the state are owned by the state, and the beds of all streams and lakes that are navigable are owned by the state. In New York, we came to this position in a funny kind of a way. The early cases decided by the lower courts sometimes took the position that the beds of navigable streams were owned by the state, and sometimes they followed the so-called English rule, the rule that was applied in England, which awarded the ownership of stream beds to the private owners. The first case that came to the Court of Appeals, the highest court of the state, said that, and this was in about 1867, it is the settled law of the state that the ownership of the beds of the navigable streams in New York are held by the state. The ownership of all of these stream beds is held by the state. 20 years later, the Court of Appeals quite unceremoniously reversed itself and said that the ownership of the beds of navigable streams are owned by the private owners. There were some difficult facts in that case involving an attempt by the city of Rochester to take allegedly excessive amounts of water from a navigable lake. For whatever reason, the Court of Appeals over this 20-year period reversed itself and gave away hundreds and hundreds of miles of stream beds owned by the people of the state to the private owners. This is probably the biggest single giveaway of public land to private owners that's ever occurred in the history of the state. My concern is that without clarifying legislation, owners of the stream beds who acquired these rights pursuant to the second line of Court of Appeals cases are encroaching, closing this stream and then that stream, and before long, unless this matter is clarified, we'll have the second biggest giveaway in the history of the state. The first giveaway gave away the ownership of the stream beds, preserving, however, the public's right to navigate. The second giveaway will give away the right to navigate itself, so that New York will be not only one of the few states with private ownership of stream beds, it will be the only state where the public does not have the right, which people have enjoyed since really Roman times, to use the navigable waterways of this state.
Private owners would consider the use of the shore particularly, and perhaps even of the riverbed, a taking. But if there is any taking involved, it has been the taking of posting river corridors in the first place by the private owners. They have taken the rights that belong to the public on rivers navigable in fact. And the taking is all on their side.
Any legislation which reenacts the common law does not effectuate a taking, because the legislation simply restates the rights and duties that people, including landowners, have, and restating in legislation a common law duty or qualifying in legislation a common law right which has a similar qualification at common law does not result in a taking. A taking results when a person has property rights and those property rights are taken away by legislation which impinges on those rights. But no owner of land along a stream which is navigable in fact has a right to exclude the public from the use of that stream. And therefore, legislation which declares the public right of passage on navigable streams takes nothing away from the private owner that the private owner actually had before. The qualifications which the common law imposes on the private owner's rights are simply restated by the law, and there's no taking. And I don't minimize the feelings that private owners may have that they would like to have privacy and enjoy the ability to have huge acreages and center themselves in those acreages and keep people out, including people who want to come boating down the stream. I don't minimize people's feelings or desires for privacy. I just don't think it's fair for them to want privacy on the public highway, want privacy at the expense of the public right. If you want to be private, I think that you need to go to a place where the public doesn't have a right to be.
The Adirondacks were once the haven for small boat recreation in this country. With the opening of waterways closed since the last century, they could be so again.
The Fulton chain of lakes is an example that has existed for a long time, which I think reflects the potential of what can be an even bigger interconnected waterway system throughout the Adirondacks. But perhaps the St. Regis canoe area is a more recent example, and I think the intensive use of that area shows how popular these kinds of routes and interconnected water bodies can be. If we can open up more of these areas and do that throughout the whole Adirondacks, I would think we're going to be the envy of the entire Northeast, if not the country.
A river is a world of its own, the very heart of the wilderness, and each river is different from every other. A river corridor is a museum gallery of natural history, and this was well known to travelers in the last century.
The state of New York has indeed been blessed with a matchless resource in the waterways of the Adirondacks. Soon, perhaps, all of New York's citizens will renew their heritage of navigation in this land of water.
In the heart of the forest, you can stand the pine, feel the time-honored battle of a drought on the line, see the view from the high peaks of the timberline, dancing to the cold river walls.
Adirondack, hear the woods as they sing, as we step to the tune of an old fiddler's strings, right across the floor like a hawk on the wing, dancing to the cold river walls. Hear all the stories the old timers can tell, hear the wind in the pines, hear the old village bell. You'll be captured forever 'neath the North Country spell.